Close your eyes and picture this. It's 1718. You are a Royal Navy captain. You have 40 guns, 200 men, and a letter of commission signed by King George himself. You have dedicated your career to order, to law, to the most powerful fleet in human history. And right now, you are losing a race to a fishing boat. You've been chasing it for 5 hours. Every time you gain a breath of distance, it tilts into the wind, finds some angle your hull refuses to hold, and pulls away again. Not dramatically, not in a burst, just steadily, inevitably, the way a tide goes out, until it's a speck, then a memory, then nothing. You are never going to catch it. What you just watched disappear over that horizon was a schooner, not a warship, not a galleon with 50 guns and a crew of hardened soldiers, a vessel that started its life ferrying cod from the Grand Banks to Boston Harbor. And it just made the Royal Navy look like a cart horse chasing a fox. For almost 3 decades, during what history now calls the Golden Age of Piracy, this single ship design did more damage to European colonial power than any admiral, any storm, any war. It let a generation of outlaws operate with near total impunity across thousands of miles of open ocean. It kept governors awake at night. It bled merchant fleets dry. And it forced the most sophisticated military institutions on Earth to completely rethink how they built ships, ran patrols, and gathered intelligence. The darkest irony? The schooner was never supposed to be a weapon. It was supposed to be a solution to a mundane commercial problem. Pirates just happened to read the blueprint better than anyone else. This is the story of how that happened.
Start with geography, because geography is where everything begins. Draw a line down the eastern coast of North America in the late 1600s. Rocky Maine headlands, the deep natural harbors of Massachusetts, the low barrier islands of the Carolinas stretching off into the Atlantic. Now follow that coastline south, past Florida, and spill out into the Caribbean. What you find there is not one ocean. It's thousands of oceans, islands stacked on islands, channels so narrow a ship needs a favorable wind just to pass through them without touching the walls. Coral reefs lurking a few feet beneath the surface, invisible until they're already tearing through your keel. Mangrove forests pressing to the waterline, hiding coves so tucked away that a vessel could anchor inside them and be completely invisible from open water 50 yards away. This geography made piracy not just possible, but almost logical. It provided everything a raider needed: hiding places, escape routes, shallow water that acted as a natural fortress against deep-hulled warships. All that was missing was the right ship to exploit it. Meanwhile, further north, shipbuilders in New England were solving a completely different problem. They needed a vessel that could handle the North Atlantic without breaking in half, one that could navigate the shallow coastal inlets that deeper ships couldn't touch, one that could move fast enough to get the day's catch to market before the ice melted and the value evaporated. Practical problems, commercial problems, the kind of problems no one writes adventure stories about. The solution they arrived at was the schooner. The origin story, the one that's been told and polished for 3 centuries, places the first true schooner in Gloucester, Massachusetts around 1713. A builder named Andrew Robinson. A new hull, a radical new sail plan. The ship slides into the water, and a dog worker watching from the pier calls out something like, "Look how she scoons," meaning the way it skimmed across the surface, flat and fast, like a stone thrown sidearm. Robinson supposedly turned around and said, "A schooner, let her be." Whether Robinson actually said those words, whether that specific conversation happened on that specific day, historians have argued about for generations. But the timing fits. The design was real. And within a decade, schooners were spreading up and down the American coast with a speed that suggests the industry recognized immediately that something important had just arrived.
To understand why the schooner was revolutionary, you need to understand what it was replacing. The dominant sailing vessel of the early 1700s, the kind the Royal Navy built, the kind wealthy merchants commissioned, the kind that carried the trade of empires, used square rigging. Massive rectangular sails hung on horizontal spars perpendicular to the ship's centerline. Picture a cross laid on its side. That's the sail plan. Square rigs were magnificent when the wind was behind you, A properly set square rigger running before a strong wind was one of the fastest things moving on the surface of the earth. The problem came the moment the wind stopped cooperating. Sailing into the wind, or even across it at a sharp angle, in a square-rigged ship was a brutal, grinding, crew-intensive process. You had to tack, meaning turn the bow through the wind, swinging all those massive horizontal spars through the air, hauling on dozens of lines, repositioning thousands of square feet of canvas, all while the ship slowed to nearly nothing and started drifting sideways. Experienced crews could do it, but it took time, it took people, and every tack bled speed and distance. The schooner didn't tack, it pivoted. Instead of sails hung across the ship, schooner sails ran along its length, fore-and-aft rigs, attached to tall masts with long booms sweeping out over the stern. These sails worked on the same aerodynamic principle as an airplane wing. As air moved across the curved canvas, it generated lift, pulling the ship forward rather than just pushing it from behind. This meant a schooner could sail at a sharp angle to the wind, almost pointing directly into it, and still make real forward progress. Where a square-rigged warship might need the wind within 30 degrees of directly behind to sail efficiently, a schooner could work with the wind nearly abeam and still move faster than almost anything else on the water. But the sail plan was only half the equation. The hull was the other half. Schooner hulls were narrow, sharp-bowed, built to cut through water rather than muscle through it, and they were shallow, drawing only 4 or 5 feet below the waterline compared to the 15 or 20 feet a Royal Navy frigate required. That number, that difference in depth, was the difference between freedom and a trap. 4 feet of draft meant a schooner could sail over a coral reef that would shred a warship's hull like paper. It meant threading through tidal channels that didn't appear on any naval chart. It meant vanishing into a bay or a river mouth where no pursuer could follow, anchoring in knee-deep water and waiting in total safety while the Navy ship sat helplessly in the deep water outside, its captain watching through a telescope and writing another letter to London about how it was all quite impossible. Combine the fore-and-aft rig with the shallow hull, and you have something genuinely new in the history of warfare, a vessel whose greatest weapon wasn't firepower. It was geometry.
Pirates didn't design the schooner. They inherited it. And then they did what skilled opportunists have always done. They understood its potential faster than the people it was built to serve. The economics were the first thing they grasped. Before the schooner, piracy was a capital-intensive enterprise. You needed a large ship, a large crew to work it, heavy cannons to threaten merchants, significant supplies for long voyages. The barrier to entry was high enough that piracy was largely a business for organized groups, usually former privateers whose government commissions had lapsed when a war ended, and who saw no reason to stop doing the only thing they knew how to do. The schooner collapsed that barrier completely. 6 men with limited means could acquire a schooner, often by capturing a small merchant vessel and simply keeping it, and immediately become a viable raiding operation. They didn't need 50 guns. They didn't need 100 crew members. They needed speed, surprise, and a willingness to board fast. The schooner provided the first 2. Desperate men provided the third. And when 6 men divided a successful raid's proceeds instead of 200, each man walked away with something that genuinely changed his life. This is why the Golden Age of Piracy expanded the way it did in the early 1700s. It wasn't a sudden increase in criminality or moral collapse. It was a technology shock. The schooner democratized violence at sea the same way the internet eventually democratized publishing and commerce. The tool became cheap enough that anyone with skill and audacity could pick it up. What followed was a crisis of scale that no colonial power had ever faced before. It wasn't one pirate with a fleet. It was 60 pirates with individual ships scattered across 4,000 miles of coastline, each one independent, each one mobile, each one nearly impossible to intercept. The old strategy, send a powerful squadron to a known pirate base and destroy it, worked fine against a fixed target. It did nothing against a threat that had no fixed location, no hierarchy to behead, and no heavy ships that had to move slowly.
The men who best understood the schooner were the men who needed it most. Benjamin Hornigold operated in the shallow labyrinth of the Bahamas and understood instinctively that the geography around Nassau was essentially impenetrable to deep-hulled warships. The islands were a natural fortress. All you needed was the right key. The schooner was the key. Hornigold's most famous protege took that lesson and built an empire around it. Edward Teach, Blackbeard. History remembers Blackbeard through his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, a massive ex-French slaver bristling with 40 guns. It was the terror, the symbol, the thing that made merchants haul down their colors at first sight of the flag. But the Queen Anne's Revenge didn't do the real work. When Blackbeard blockaded Charleston Harbor in 1718, one of the most brazen acts of piracy in the colonial era, shutting down a major American port for a week, it was his schooners that executed the operation. When a merchant tried to run the blockade, Blackbeard didn't send his flagship lumbering in pursuit through the shallow coastal waters off the Carolinas. He sent a schooner, fast, low, already moving before the merchant captain had finished deciding to run. By the time the merchant realized his mistake, there were armed men on his deck. The Queen Anne's Revenge was the fist that made you freeze. The schooners were the hands that actually took your wallet. Charles Vane understood this at a cellular level. Vane operated the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, the choke point of Caribbean trade, with a patience and precision that frustrated every naval officer sent to deal with him. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a fleet and a mandate to end Bahamian piracy, most pirates accepted his pardon and retired. Vane responded by loading a captured ship with explosives, lighting it on fire, and sailing it into Rogers' anchored fleet.
While Rogers' sailors were scrambling to avoid being incinerated, Vane slipped his schooner between the warships, caught the night wind, and vanished. Rogers' faster vessels gave chase. They did not catch him. Vane raided for months afterward, operating in waters that Rogers' navy controlled in theory and couldn't touch in practice. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, took the schooner's tactical potential and industrialized it. Roberts captured over 400 ships during his career. No pirate in history comes close to that number. His method was essentially a military doctrine. Use larger ships as mobile bases, deploy schooners as forward scouts and fast attack elements, fan them out across a target area to identify, isolate, and cut off specific vessels before the full operation closed in. Roberts didn't just raid, he ran campaigns. Then there was Calico Jack Rackham, who occupies a different place in this story. Rackham wasn't Blackbeard. He wasn't Roberts. He was a small operator working one schooner through the waters around Jamaica, taking fishing boats and coastal traders, living month to month. His ship was his home, his income, and his only edge over the authorities who wanted him dead. He lost that edge, the only way you could lose it, by sitting still. In October 1720, pirate hunter Jonathan Barnett found Rackham anchored in a Jamaican bay, his crew so drunk on captured rum that they could barely stand. Barnett's sloop came in unopposed. Rackham surrendered without a real fight. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the rest of the crew were taken along with him. If Rackham had been at sea when Barnett arrived, if he'd had an hour's warning, the schooner would have solved the problem. Barnett would have written a report about a pirate he couldn't catch. The schooner could do many things. It could not sail itself. The men in London reading the dispatches from Caribbean governors didn't fully grasp the physics of what they were being told. A square-rigged warship tacking upwind loses enormous ground with every turn. The bow swings through 90 degrees or more. The sails go slack and then refill on the new tack. Speed bleeds away. Distance bleeds away. A schooner tacking upwind turns through a fraction of that arc, loses almost no speed, and comes out of the turn still accelerating.
Over a 6-hour chase directly into the wind, this isn't a marginal difference. The schooner can cover twice the effective distance. A Navy captain watching through his telescope could see the gap growing with each passing hour, could do the arithmetic in his head, could know with complete certainty that he would not close that distance today or any day. And there was nothing, not seamanship, not courage, not the best officers in the most powerful navy on earth, that could change it. Governor Woodes Rogers put it plainly in one of his dispatches to London. Sending a fifth-rate warship after a pirate schooner was like trying to catch a greyhound with a cart horse. You could run the cart horse until it dropped. The greyhound would still be gone. The Admiralty's response was for years essentially bureaucratic. Piracy was an annoyance. European great power politics was the real concern. The ships, the funding, the officers, they went where the strategic priority was, and the strategic priority was not the Caribbean.
When the solution finally arrived, it came from two directions simultaneously. The first was intelligence. The navies stopped trying to outrace pirates and started trying to outthink them. Informants, turned pirates, captured crew members who knew their former captain's routes and preferred anchorages. If you couldn't catch a schooner at sea, you could sometimes predict where it would be and set a trap in advance. A fast sloop at one end of a shipping lane, another at the other end, closing inward with foreknowledge rather than speed.
The second was design evolution. The Bermuda sloop, built from local cedar on Bermuda, light and weatherly and shallow, became the Royal Navy's answer to the schooner. Not quite as nimble, but close enough, and armed well enough to matter when it got alongside. The Navy began building purpose-designed anti-piracy vessels that borrowed directly from the principles that had been humiliating them for 30 years. Sustained pressure, better intelligence, purpose-built ships. Slowly, through the late 1720s and into the 1730s, the Golden Age collapsed. Not in a single dramatic battle, in a long, grinding accumulation of captures, hangings, and a cost-benefit calculation that stopped adding up for the men who might otherwise have gone on the account. The schooner didn't retire when piracy ended. Its next chapter was darker. After Britain and the United States outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1807 and 1808, traffickers turned to schooners for the same reasons pirates had. Speed to outrun patrols, shallow draft to navigate the creeks and hidden inlets of the African coast, small enough to avoid detection until it was too late. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron spent decades fighting the same battle its Caribbean predecessors had fought a century earlier. Too slow, too deep, too big to reliably intercept vessels built to evade exactly that kind of pursuit. The same hull lines that helped pirates vanish with stolen sugar were now carrying stolen people across the Atlantic. During the American Revolution, schooners became the first vessels of the Continental Navy. The logic was identical to the pirates. We can't match them in firepower, so we'll match them in speed. Privateers during both the Revolution and the War of 1812 ran the same playbook. Fast schooners raiding British supply lines, disappearing before the escorts could respond, making British merchants write the same furious letters to their own government that colonial governors had been writing 60 years earlier.
During Prohibition, rum runners in schooners outpaced Coast Guard cutters through the same coastal waters, exploiting the same shallow inlets and the same speed advantages. And what was essentially the Golden Age of Piracy performed again with internal combustion engines and Canadian whiskey. The ship changed, the physics didn't. What the schooner accomplished in the early 1700s was something rarer than it sounds. It gave a small number of people with limited resources a genuine sustained asymmetric advantage over the most powerful military institutions in the world. Not for a week, not for a season, for decades. It forced those institutions to spend enormous sums of money, restructure their procurement priorities, develop new intelligence methods, and fundamentally rethink how they defined naval power. All because a handful of shipwrights in Massachusetts solved a commercial fishing problem in an unexpectedly elegant way. The pirates of the Golden Age are remembered as adventurers, criminals, romantics. What they actually were early adopters. They looked at a new technology, understood its implications faster than the governments and navies who might have used it against them, and built an entire operational model around those implications before anyone in a position of authority had figured out how to respond. By the time the response came, the damage was done. The wealth had moved. The mythology had formed. The map of the Caribbean had been permanently altered. All of it tracing back to a man in a Massachusetts shipyard who decided the sails should run the other way.